Mary Elmes, the unsung Irish hero of the Holocaust. In the heart of Cork City, there stands a bridge, not grand or iconic, but quiet and purposeful, much like the woman it honours. A woman whose story remained hidden for nearly 70 years. A woman who saved hundreds of children from certain death, yet spent her life avoiding recognition. This is the story of Mary Elmes, Ireland's first and only person honoured as righteous among the nations. Born into an era of violence, Mary Elmes was born on May 5, 1908, into a Church of Ireland family in the Ballintemple district of Cork. Her father, Edward, was a pharmacist who had moved from Waterford to Cork after qualifying and ran J. Waters and Sons dispensing chemists on Winthrop Street. Her mother, Elizabeth Waters, was no ordinary woman of her time. She was a suffragette, the treasurer of the Munster Women's Franchise League, campaigning for women's right to vote. Mary had one younger brother, John, who would eventually take over the family pharmacy. The siblings attended Rochelle School in Blackrock, Cork, a modern and well-equipped establishment that tried unsuccessfully to shield its students from the political turmoil of the time. It was Mary's fate to be born into an era where violence seemed far too often to be the overweening factor in the direction of the world. From a young age, she was exposed to the horrors that human beings could inflict upon one another. On May 7, 1915, when Mary was just 7 years old, the Cunard ocean liner Lusitania was torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Cork. Mary and her family, along with thousands of other Corkonians, rushed to the quays in Cove to help those who had survived. She would later describe to her children what she saw that day and how those scenes of human suffering and the desperate efforts to save lives had influenced the rest of her life. 5 years later, during the War of Independence in 1920, the family business was burned out by British forces. Despite the chaos and violence surrounding her childhood, Mary's parents encouraged her to travel and study, to look beyond the borders of Ireland. From December 1925 until January 1927, Mary relocated to Meudon, Paris, where she became fluent in French. When she returned to Cork, she helped raise funds for the Cork Child Welfare League with the Rochelle Old Girls Association. Even as a young woman, her compassion for vulnerable children was evident. A career of academic excellence. In 1928, Mary Elmes enrolled at Trinity College Dublin. She excelled beyond measure. She was elected a scholar and gained a first in modern literature, studying both French and Spanish. Her academic brilliance was so evident that she was awarded a gold medal upon graduation, a medal her son would still possess decades later. But Mary's aspirations extended beyond academic honours. In 1935, as a result of her exceptional achievements, she was awarded a scholarship in international studies at the London School of Economics. She received a certificate in international studies and won yet another scholarship in 1936 to continue her education at the Geneva School of International Studies in Switzerland. A respectable academic career lay ahead of her. She could have spent her life in the comfortable halls of universities, teaching, writing, researching. But 1936 was also the year the Spanish Civil War broke out. Years of polarization and division in Spanish society had finally erupted into a fratricidal conflict. In February 1937, while attending the International Relations Summer School in Geneva, Mary made a decision that would change the course of her life. She gave up her aspiring career in academia to volunteer and help refugees escaping the Spanish Civil War. A letter from a Mrs. Small at the Geneva office of Save the Children mentioned that a certain Miss Elmes wanted to work in Spain as a volunteer. When Mary arrived in Gibraltar, she had a permit to stay for just 5 days. She would stay 2 years. Baptism by fire in Spain. Initially, the relief office didn't know what to do with her. They had put out an urgent call for doctors and nurses, but Mary Elmes had no medical training. They assigned her to the University of London ambulance unit and later to a feeding station in Almeria.
Nothing could have prepared the 28-year-old for the suffering she would witness in Almeria on the southeast coast of Spain. Some 80,000 people had taken refuge there after walking through machine gun fire and daily bombardment on the 120-mile journey from Malaga. Around 5,000 died en route, and thousands more had turned back. Despite her lack of medical qualifications, Mary's ability to speak Spanish fluently, combined with her drive and determination, quickly proved her capabilities. She started work in a children's hospital in Almeria and soon showed such aptitude that she was put in charge of a new and well-equipped hospital in Alicante. However, her spell there was short-lived. When continual destroyer bombardment put the children in her care in real danger, she fled with them to Polop, a village near Benidorm. A British nurse and friend, Dorothy Lytton, described how Mary made a refuge out of the summer residence of a rich man who had fled to a more suitable spot for rich men. The nurse went on to say that Mary was marvellous in planning meals out of our very meagre resources. At the end of 1937, devastating news reached Mary from Cork. Her father Edward had died. She desperately wanted to go home for the funeral, but she told her mother she wouldn't leave unless she could find someone to replace her. There was no one. Mary missed her father's funeral because she refused to abandon the children who depended on her. In January 1939, Mary was appointed by the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker humanitarian organization, to run a hospital they were establishing in Alicante. Though Mary herself was not a Quaker, she would work closely with the organization for years to come. As Franco's forces advanced and the Spanish Civil War drew to its bloody conclusion, Mary was forced to move north with the refugees. In May 1939, Howard Kirshner, head of the American Friends Service Committee, drove Mary and some fellow workers across the border into France, bringing with them the records of their work in Spain. Mary was evacuated to the AFSC regional headquarters in Perpignan in the south of France. She helped set up workshops, canteens, schools and hospitals. The conditions in the refugee camps were horrific. The scenes I witnessed might have been from Dante's Inferno, wrote Catalan cellist and refugee Pablo Casals, who knew Mary and worked with her. He described one camp where people were herded together like animals, penned in by barbed wire, housed, if one can call it that, in tents and crumbling shacks. Despite the overwhelming need, Mary wrote to a colleague in July 1939, "I cannot tell you how glad I am to have the prospect of doing something for my Spanish friends again." It is estimated that Mary, along with her Quaker colleagues, provided food to over 84,000 children in schools facing famine conditions in southern France. The camps would later reach breaking points when the Second World War broke out, and they started to fill with German refugees, who were now considered aliens in France. The darkest hour. The Nazis invaded France in 1940. The collaborationist and anti-Semitic Vichy regime was established in the south. Jews began to be targeted by the Gestapo and the Vichy regime's police. Many Jews fled to the south of France, and Mary joined them, volunteering again with the American Friends Service Committee. By this time, Mary was in charge of the AFSC office in Perpignan. Her work included overseeing various camps for Spanish refugees on the coast and running canteens in schools throughout a region about the size of Munster. There was scarcely a town or village in that huge area that did not receive help in some form from the AFSC office in Perpignan. Mary worked closely with her colleague and dear friend Alice Resch, a Norwegian nurse based at the Toulouse office. Their letters to each other reveal the enormous scope of their work and the deep bonds they formed. They wrote back and forth constantly, about securing identity papers, food, clothing, and medical supplies for refugees. They discussed getting books and writing materials so they could continue to school the refugees. They mentioned individuals and their particular needs. A doctor who needed support after a stroke. A man who needed clothes after being released from hospital. The need for extra food to feed an arriving refugee train. Mary was beloved by all who worked with her. In 1942, a visitor from the AFSC office in Philadelphia remarked, "Everywhere Mary went, she was greeted with great warmth and affection, and we could not walk very far without being stopped by someone who wished to talk with her." One could see very plainly that Miss Mary, as they all call her, brought joy to many people on her regular, frequent visits to the camp. The camp in question was Rivesaltes, near Perpignan. It was a permanent camp, relatively new, that had been an army camp never used because it was said to be unsuitable even for horses. It was too cold in winter and too hot in summer. Yet thousands of people were sent there when it first opened as a refugee camp in 1941. The living conditions were inhumane. There were lice and rat infestations. The camp consisted of huts and toilets. Malnutrition was a huge problem. An American Friends Service Committee report highlighted the plight of those held there. The internees are cold during the night, they are cold during the day, and their food is served to them cold. They crouch in unheated barracks and have no extra blankets or clothes to protect them against the searching wind. By the end of its first year, there were more than 4,000 people in the camp, a third of them children. The Quakers, along with other aid organisations, set up canteens and workshops in hopes of relieving some of the suffering. But from 1942 on, a new and terrible reality descended. The Vichy authorities made it clear that Jewish children were no longer legally exempt from deportation to concentration camps. Rivesaltes became the holding centre for all the Jews in non-occupied France. They were brought there from wherever they could be found. Between August and October 1942, 9 convoys took 2,300 Jews from Rivesaltes camp to Drancy outside Paris, and from there to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Among them were 2,141 Jewish adults and 110 children. Despite efforts by French officials to convince inmates that they were going to farms and factories, the Jewish prisoners knew the fate that awaited them. Some committed suicide. Parents were separated from their children. Mary Elmes didn't believe the lie either. Mennonite aid worker Lois Gundon was in charge of Cannet Plage, a centre on the Mediterranean established by Mary Elmes. On August 9, 1942, she wrote in her diary, "Mary informed me about return of Polish and German Jews to Poland, where death by starvation awaits them." The next day, she wrote, "Miss Elmes had brought us 3 Jewish boys in an attempt to save them when their parents leave. Had quite some time quieting the poor little fellow, but finally his sobs died down." Lois Gundon went on to describe the steady stream of children brought by Miss Elmes to the relative safety of the Villa Saint-Christophe colony. On August 11, 1942, she wrote, "While we were eating supper, Miss Elmes brought 7 Jewish children, some of whom can't speak French. Isidore Moussol cooked some extra macaroni. What a comedy to wash them in the wash basin. The boys didn't want to take off their pants. It was far from comedy. It was a chilling reminder of how parents had warned their circumcised sons to keep their pants on to hide the fact that they were Jewish." Spiriting children to safety. Mary Elmes faced a terrible moral dilemma. As historian Denis Peshansky of the French National Centre for Scientific Research would later explain, they knew the truth about the trains, but if they left, all of the prisoners would die. Mary had a unique opportunity. Because she was from neutral Ireland, she was able to stay on in Rivesaltes after World War II began, when others were forced to leave. Her superiors, who knew of her activities, warned her not to do too much, for fear that their humanitarian work would be halted. But Mary persisted. Well aware that she was putting herself at risk, she was determined to save as many children as possible. Risking being sent to Auschwitz herself, she began to spirit children away from the camp. When Mary heard the news in September 1942 that children could now be deported, she immediately put a group of children into her own car and drove them to safety. She came back the next day to rescue others. Documents from the time give details of how she spirited away 9 Jewish children from the first convoy bound for Auschwitz in August 1942. She hid many children in the boot of her car and drove them high up into the Pyrenees Mountains to remote villages, to Catholic orphanages, to safe houses she had organized earlier in the war, which were located in the foothills of the Pyrenees and along the coast. On a daily basis, Mary worked tirelessly, driving long distances, scrounging milk and blankets for the children in the camp. She helped dozens more by getting parental permission to bring them to safer Quaker colonies, or to help them leave the country entirely, securing documents which allowed them to escape through the well-established network operating undercover in Vichy, France. She managed to smuggle others across the border into neutral Spain. Many of those children would never see their parents again. Mary Elmes and Lois Gundon together formed a chain of solidarity with the Jews. If discovered, anyone attempting to rescue Jewish children would be sent to the death camps with them. Meanwhile, Alice Resch was smuggling children away from a French orphanage called Aspet in the Pyrenees. In her memoir, Over the Highest Mountains, she wrote, "We claimed that the colony was too far away and gave Coste, the director of the Office for Aliens, a fictional list of people who were willing to take the children into their homes. The youngest came to Larade, where we erased the Juif mark from their papers." Surviving documents describe the network in operation. In one letter dated April 25, 1942, Alice Resch wrote to Mary, "The permission for your 12 children from Rivesaltes to come to Larade has been obtained, so you can ship them off to us any time you like." She added, however, not to bring them on a Thursday or a Sunday if possible, as the home had prepared terrific washing and disinfection schemes. In August 1942, Alice wrote, "The world is chaos here on account of all the happenings. We are swimming in work here, but you are too, certainly, with all these sad events." It is difficult to say exactly how many people Mary Elmes saved, but it is clear she played a pivotal role in saving the lives of at least 200 Jewish children, though some estimates suggest the number was much higher. She also helped thousands of non-Jewish refugees, providing food, shelter and medical help to the hundreds of thousands of refugees who were displaced by war. The number of children deported from Rivesaltes would have been considerably greater had it not been for the intervention of Mary and her colleagues in the other organizations. Two brothers. On September 25, 1942, 2 young boys huddled silently under a blanket in the back of a large black car as it crossed under the gaze of the French prison guards and out the wooden gates of Rivesaltes internment camp. René and Mario Freund, aged 2 and 6 years old, were escaping deportation to Auschwitz and certain death in the gas chambers. They were being driven high up into the Pyrenees Mountains to a remote village. The boys had already faced danger before. Their father, Hans Freund, had tried and failed to smuggle them across the border into Switzerland. When police stopped young René and his mother Eva at the border, Hans and Mario turned back. The entire family was detained at Rivesaltes. In the camp, Hans Freund approached Mary Elmes and asked her to take his 2 boys away. She agreed. The boys never saw their father again. Hans Freund was deported to Majdanek camp in 1943, where he perished. After arriving in the hills, the boys were met by a priest, Father Louis Bézard, who hid them in a suitcase as they passed through Toulouse train station under intense Gestapo surveillance. They were moved to a small village called Marsac in southern France, where they arrived upset, frightened and starving, spending a few days at the presbytery to recover their strength. The brothers, then known as René and Mario Freund, but now known as Ronald and Michael Freund, were fostered by separate families, baptized as Catholics, and mixed in with other children attending the local school. In 1943, Ronald Freund was 5 years old when he and his brother crossed in a horrendous storm from Dieppe to England, where they were met by an uncle. I remember him coming to collect us because he had some cherries, the emeritus professor of psychology would later recall. He put me in the baggage rack and I was spitting cherry pits down on top of him. That's the part I remember. The brothers were finally reunited with their mother Eva in 1947. Another child saved. George Coltine was another child whose life was saved by Mary Elmes. His family had escaped from Paris to Vichy-controlled France after police raided their apartment building. However, they were arrested on arrival and sent to Rivesaltes. George's father was put into a work gang, but Mary smuggled the children out of the camp and into the orphanage of St. Christopher in Perpignan. The orphanage was run by Lois Gundon, who has also been recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations. Lois sheltered the children among the local orphans, where police would not find them. Elmes drove 7 children to St. Christopher's that day, George Coltine would later recall. Mary Elmes and Lois Gundon together formed a chain of solidarity with the Jews. If discovered, anyone attempting to rescue Jewish children would be sent to the death camps with them. Arrested by the Gestapo. On February 5, 1943, German police arrested Mary Elmes. There's no record of how she felt when it happened, but her mother Elizabeth would later say it came as a dreadful shock when the news filtered through a month later. Mary was to be charged with espionage. She was suspected of a series of hostile acts against Germany, secret border crossings, information of all kinds, and propaganda against the Reich. At first, her colleagues at the Geneva office were under the impression that it was something she had written in a letter. Whatever the charges, though none were ever pressed, her employers, the American Friends Service Committee, were deeply distressed by news of her arrest. They immediately sent a telegram to the Irish authorities looking for help. The telegram read, "Request intervention, International Red Cross and Irish Minister, Lisbon, on behalf of Mary Elmes, trusted Quaker relief worker since 1938. Stop." At first, Mary was held in Toulouse prison, where her colleagues were allowed to visit and bring food parcels. But they lost all contact when she was moved to the notorious Gestapo-held Fresnes prison outside Paris. Fresnes housed members of the French resistance and captured British Special Operations executives. Many of the people held there never got out again. An unnamed British officer wrote of the prison's atmosphere at that time. The threat of violence was almost as bad as the reality. They left you on your own a lot, to stew and to worry, and it worked. In June 1943, Mary's employers became concerned for her welfare. They wrote to the Honourable Robert Brennan, Minister from Ireland in Washington, and appealed to him to make representations to the Irish government to have her released. She is now held incommunicado in Fresnes prison in Paris. The committee's Foreign Service Secretary, James G. Vail, told Mr. Brennan. She is said to be in very poor health, although under ordinary circumstances she is a vigorous person. Miss Elmes is a person of goodwill, exceptionally effective in dealing with the problems of distressed people. She speaks Spanish and French without accent, and we are convinced that there is no valid reason for her detention. Several letters went back and forth between France, Ireland and America. Meanwhile, at home in Ballintemple in Cork City, Mary's mother Elizabeth made sure to include nothing more than family chit-chat in her letter of March 13th, 1943. She wasn't hopeful that it would ever reach her daughter, but she left the envelope open anyway, in case wartime censors checked its contents. Mrs. Elmes was far more forthright in her letters to Margaret Frawley of the American Friends Service Committee, which reveal her deep worry. She was sure that her daughter had done no wrong. She had planned to visit Mary in Paris, but her doctor advised her against it, saying it would put too much strain on her heart. Mary's brother John visited Paris and obtained permission to visit her. Eventually, the International Red Cross succeeded in getting messages through to Mary. They delivered food parcels too. Messages were relayed out to say that her health had improved. In a Red Cross message to her aunt, Mary wrote, "Well, 52 kilos. Wrote mummy today, also week ago. Glad to be back in nice flat with all belongings." Her mother had asked her for her weight in a previous dispatch and was glad to report that Mary was no lighter now than she had been when she went to France in 1939. Finally, in July 1943, after many representations by the Irish consulate in Vichy, France, the International Red Cross, and the tireless efforts of the Quaker organisations, Mary was released after spending 6 months in prison. When asked about her time in prison years later, Mary would simply say, "Oh, we all had to suffer some inconveniences in those days." Her mother had hoped that Mary would leave France for Switzerland or Portugal, but she had no intention of abandoning the people who needed her. She went straight back to work. While she was in prison, 6 months' salary had accrued, but Mary wrote to her employers saying she didn't want it. She returned the money, asking head office to spend it on whatever was needed. By the time she was freed from Fresnes, there were no Jews left in Rivesaltes. Mary would stay on at her office in Perpignan until the end of the war. After the war, in 1947, the British and American Quakers were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their relief work during the war. Mary Elmes's children say the French government offered her its highest honour, the Légion d'honneur. She turned it down, preferring instead to try to put the war behind her, declining the award on the grounds of unwanted attention for what she had done. Mary married a Frenchman named Roger d'Anjou from Perpignan, and the couple had 2 children, Caroline and Patrick. After the war, she continued living in Pyrénées-Orientales in northern Catalonia, where she had been active, first in Perpignan and then in Canet-en-Roussillon and Sainte-Marie-la-Mer. Both Caroline and Patrick say that their mother preferred not to talk about the war, and they knew little of her work with refugees growing up. Mary did not speak much of what she had done, and declined every award and distinction she was offered. She was modest to the end of her days. Mary and her children returned to Ireland several times, and her children would visit her old house at Ballintemple. "My mother never had the courage to return to her former home, but we were welcomed there with opened arms," Caroline d'Anjou recalls. Mary Elmes died in a nursing home in Perpignan on March 9, 2002, at the age of 93.
70 years to find a name. It would take Professor Ronald Friend almost 70 years to identify the person who saved his life. Although he had spent years piecing together the details of his early childhood, that final piece of the jigsaw had always eluded him. He had the end of the story, but not the beginning. He had known of his family's near escape over the Swiss border in 1942. He had evidence that he had been spirited away to a safe house in Toulouse. He even met Father Louis Bézard, who had hidden him and his brother in a suitcase. In 1958, Father Bézard wrote an account of the escape, but Ronald Friend had never been able to establish who got him out of the camp. Then, one morning in January 2011, an email popped into his inbox with a name. The archivist of OSE, a Jewish organization, wrote to give him the name of his rescuer, Mary Elmes, head of the Quaker delegation at Perpignan. "We have letters that Mary Elmes and her co-workers wrote," the archivist explained. Professor Friend started to research Mary Elmes, and with help from a British college lecturer named Bernard Wilson, details of an extraordinary woman's life started to emerge. Her childhood in Cork City, her brilliant academic achievements, her work with refugees in the Spanish Civil War and Second World War, her 6-month term in a Gestapo prison. Decades earlier, Bernard Wilson had been fascinated to read that Quakers had been involved in Spain and later in the internment camps of the south of France. He began to unravel that story, and in doing so, he also brought Mary Elmes's considerable contribution to light. He would later write a children's book based on her life. In 2012, Professor Friend contacted Mary's family to ask their permission to nominate her for the Righteous Among Nations Award at Yad Vashem, the official memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. They were initially reluctant, as their mother had been so discreet. However, they were keen to see her work recognized. "I owe my life to Elmes and I feel very grateful," said Ronald Friend, "but I am just one of many who should feel the same." His brother Michael Freund echoed the sentiment. "I owe my life to her." Professor Friend went on to nominate Mary Elmes for the award. On January 23, 2013, 11 years after her death, she was posthumously recognized by Yad Vashem as Righteous Among the Nations. Her children and grandchildren received the award on her behalf. She became the first, and to date, only Irish person to receive the honour. "I am still upset that no one had nominated her earlier," Professor Friend says. "It's an aberration. She was clearly a leader among those with whom she worked. She showed the way." In 2014, friends, relatives and Professor Friend commemorated Mary Elmes at an award ceremony at Canet-en-Roussillon in the south of France. A remarkable thing happened during Professor Friend's visit. He and his son Sean went to see his old school at Marsac. He asked directions from a man who immediately recognized him as a former classmate. From 1943, Guy Brunet invited father and son to his house for a drink and later presented him with a photo of their time in school together. A 1943 school photograph showing young Ronald Friend in the middle row, third from left, mixed in with the local children. Professor Friend later received another gift from Mary's children, some of her china bowls, a treasured memento of the woman who saved his life. Bringing her out of the shadows. Mary Elmes's story became more widely known following a 1998 Mexican documentary on the Spanish Civil War, in which she agreed to be interviewed, one of the rare times she spoke publicly about her experiences. Thanks to the quest by the two grateful brothers and the work of researchers like Bernard Wilson, the story of her personal valor has been highlighted. A documentary called It Tolls for Thee was created, narrated by Winona Ryder, who herself had relatives murdered in the Holocaust, and who was nominated for a Grammy for her audio version of The Diary of Anne Frank. The film was screened at the Irish Film Institute's Documentary Festival in Dublin. Director Andrew Gallimore said, "I was amazed when I first heard Elmes's story, how it had remained so unknown for so long. Elmes did such great work for the refugees, but she had to be vigilant not to be seen giving special assistance to the Jews who were the most in need of it. It bothers Caroline d'Anjou that her mother is so little known in her own country. Her brother Patrick wrote to Mary's alma mater Trinity College in 2014 to invite them to commemorate an exceptional past pupil, but received no response. The London School of Economics didn't reply either. However, recognition has slowly come. On September 30th, 2016, Mary was posthumously awarded the Trish Murphy Award at the Network Ireland Business Woman of the Year Awards in Cork, which was accepted by her nephew, Mark Elmes, on behalf of her family. In 2016, Bernard Wilson spoke about Mary at the National Conference of Network Ireland in Cork. Mary Elmes was also one of 5 women remembered in an international symposium on women in wartime organised by Smashing Times Theatre Company. On February 25, 2019, Cork City Council announced that a new pedestrian bridge linking Patrick's Quay to Merchant's Quay would be named after Mary Elmes. It was opened to the public on July 9, 2019. Her son Patrick and some of those whom she saved attended the opening ceremony in September 2019. The architects designed the bridge to be broad enough to accommodate both cyclists and pedestrians. However, there is no segregation between them, thereby requiring cyclists to cycle more slowly, pedestrians to be more careful, and everyone to show a little more tolerance, patience and kindness. A fitting symbol indeed to commemorate Mary Elmes. The Mary Elmes Prize in Holocaust Studies has been established and is distributed by the Holocaust Educational Trust Ireland. Professor Ronald Friend thinks she should be honoured further in her own country. Perhaps a statue or plaque in Cork, he says. She should be written up in history books and recognised by the Irish government. Thank you for trying to take my mother out of the shadows of history, said Caroline d'Anjou. Closing. As one walks west-northwest along the north side of Cork City's bustling quays, the Mary Elmes Bridge provides the first chance to contemplate the river free from the noise and smell of traffic. It's an understated structure. Its designers never claimed that it was going to be another iconic edifice, and perhaps the person to whom this unassuming but elegant bridge is dedicated would not have had it any other way. Mary Elmes was born on May 5, 1908 and died on March 9, 2002. Like her compatriot Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, her story is not well known, but it should be. She was an extraordinary woman, very brave, courageous and selfless in her efforts to help others.